The flesh was in the middle of the front room when Martin Cobb came down for his coffee, and the first thing he felt, before the fear, was a small and stupid irritation. The kind a man feels when he finds a chair moved or a window left open, because this was his floor and nothing belonged on it that he had not put there himself. It sat on the boards where June's reading chair used to be, about the size of a closed fist, pale as the underside of a tongue, threaded through with faint blue, and it was breathing. Not heaving, not panting, just the slow, patient swell and fall of something asleep. A rise and a long settling, and then at the bottom of each settling, a sound. A small wet exhale, a sigh. Cobb stood at the foot of the stairs in his socks and listened to it sigh. He was 61 years old, and he had buried a wife 8 months gone, and he had spent most of his life fixing things that other men found too far out to bother with, pumps and wellheads, and the diesel generators at the relay stations up the cold spine of the county. And so his hands knew, before his head did, that this was not a thing he could fix. He went and crouched over it anyway. He could feel the warmth coming off it from a foot away. A body warmth, blood warmth, and that was the part that turned his stomach, because the floor was cold, and the house was cold, and this thing was the temperature of a living animal, of a held hand. He poked it with the handle of the wood spoon he was still holding. It dimpled and pushed back, pressed harder, and the flesh paled around the pressure, and the breathing hitched, caught, and then resumed, and somewhere under the floorboards, he heard a sound like a root settling in dry ground, a tightening. "All right," he said, to the room. To June, maybe, who had been the one he said things to. "All right." He got the long screwdriver and the pry bar, and he worked the boards up around it, the way you'd open a floor to find a leak. And what he found was that the flesh did not sit on the wood. It came up through it. It went down into the dark crawl under the house in a pale cord no thicker than his thumb, and that cord had grown around the floor joist the way ivy grows around a fence wire, snug, knowing, and where it touched the old dry pine, the wood had gone soft and gray and damp. He shone his light down into the crawl space, and the cord ran off into the dark toward the center of the house, and he did not follow it with the beam, because he found that he did not want to see how far it went. He sat back on his heels with the cold coming up through his knees, and he looked at the thing breathing in the lamp of his work light, and he said the only true thing he had, "I don't know what you are." The flesh sighed. He did not sleep that first night. He sat in the kitchen, with the shotgun across his knees, which embarrassed him even as he did it, because what was he going to do, shoot his own floor? And he listened to the house. The house had always talked at night, the way old houses do, the ticking of the stove cooling, the wind finding the loose flashing on the north gable, the creak of the stairs giving back the day's heat. But under all of that now, there was the breathing, slow and even. And the worst of it, the thing that kept the gun across his knees, was that by 3 in the morning, he understood that the breathing had found his. That when he drew a long breath in the dark, the flesh drew one too, a half-second behind, like a child learning a song by following the singer. And when he held his breath to test it, the flesh held its own. And the silence where the two of them did not breathe was the loudest thing he had ever heard in that house. Louder than the night June stopped. He had not always lived alone at the end of the county road. That was the thing the quiet kept reminding him of. The breathing thing in the front room, only the latest in a long line of things that lived in the house and made noise, and were not June. 30 years, he had run the cold spine for the utility, the high country where the relay stations sat on their guide towers above the tree line, and the diesel gensets had to be coaxed through winters that ate the rubber off your boots. Other men quit that work by 40. The cold got into the joints, or the loneliness got into the head. The long white drives with nothing on the radio but the hiss between stations. And they went down to the valley and took the indoor jobs, and got soft and got old slow. Cobb stayed. He liked the work the way you like a hard old dog. For its honesty, for the way it never pretended to be anything but what it was. Pump was broken or it was not. A genset turned over or it did not. Maybe in it no 3 months at the foot of a bed watching a thing you loved be slowly, politely, unstoppably taken from you while your good hands hung at your sides with nothing in the whole world for them to do. June had married all of it. Cold runs, The grease under the nails that never quite came clean, the way he went quiet for days after a bad winter, and then talked too much for a week to make up for it. She used to say she'd married 9 different men, and they all answered to Martin. And she'd be damned if she could keep them straight, and she'd say it laughed, with that lift in her voice, that small, upward turn she put on his name when she wanted him to come and look at something out the window. She had kept finding things to look at right up to the end. A light on the dead reservoir, bird working the fence line, the way the frost made ferns on the inside of the glass. He had thought, in the worst of the grief, that the looking would have run out in her eventually, that there were only so many small wonders in a life, and she had spent hers. But he knew now that was a lie. He told himself so. The loss would have a bottom to it. The looking would never have run out. That was what she was. She was a thing that could not stop finding the world worth a second glance, and the world had taken her anyway, the way it took everything, in no pattern, for no reason a man could write down and hold. So when the breathing started in the wall, and he understood by 3 in the morning that the house was listening back, that some warm thing in his front room was learning the shape of his breath, and giving it back to him a half-beat slow. The part of him that should have been afraid was instead, for one shameful unguarded moment, grateful. The house had a second pulse in it again. He hated that he was grateful. He sat with the gun across his knees, and hated it, and was grateful anyway. And that, though he did not know it yet, was the first thread the thing had pulled loose. The first true thing it had learned about the species that kept the radios going. That a lonely one of them will feed the thing that is eating it, just to not be alone in the dark. In the morning it was bigger, not by much, the width of 2 fingers maybe, but its surface had changed. Where it had been smooth it now had a pucker, a fold, a small wet seam, and over the next days that seam opened and closed and opened, working at the air, and Cobb, who had grown things and gutted things and watched things be born in barns, knew the shape of it before he let himself name it. It was making an ear, pale-cupped whirl of an ear. Blind and new, turning by slow degrees toward the kitchen where he kept the radio going for the company of voices. He turned the radio off. The ear turned toward the kettle. So he understood, in the dumb animal way you understand weather, that it was listening, that it wanted sound, the way a seedling wants light. And because he was a man who had spent 8 months in a house, where the only voice was his own, he made a decision that he would not have been able to explain to anyone, and that he barely explained to himself, which was that he would not let it grow itself an ear in silence. He turned the radio back on. He talked to it while he made his coffee. He told it the weather, and he told it the price of diesel, and he told it that it had no business in June's spot, none at all, and the ear turned toward him, and the breathing followed his, and something in the deep animal floor of him eased a single notch, the way it had not eased in 8 months. Because for the first time since the funeral the house was listening back. That was the trap, of course. He worked that out later. That was the thing it was built to do. He did try, those first days, to do the same thing, the thing a man is supposed to do, which is to make it somebody else's problem. He drove the 40 minutes of bad road down to where the cell signal started, and he sat in the truck with the phone in his hand, and found that he did not know who to call. There was no number for a flesh that breathed your breath back at you. The county would send a man to look at a septic line or a downed wire. They would not send a man to look at this, and if he described it true, they would send a different kind of man, the kind that came for the ones who lived too long alone at the end of a road and started talking about things in the walls. He thought about it, the doctor in the valley, the one who'd been kind during June. He thought about driving to the relay station and raising the dispatcher on the radio he understood better than any phone and saying, what, exactly? He sat in the truck for an hour, with the engine ticking and the cold coming in, and in the end he drove the 40 minutes back up to the house. Because the truth, the one he could not say into any phone, was that the house was the last place June had been, and the thing in it was the only thing in 8 months that had answered when he spoke. And a man does not drive away from the only thing that answers, even when it shouldn't. When he came back it had moved. Only a little, a hand's width across the floor toward the kitchen door, the cord behind it stretched, and the old cord path through the boards already gone gray and soft. And he understood it was not rooted to one spot the way he'd thought. It was rooted to the house. Put down a new cord anywhere. The wood was soft, and pull up the old one. The way a vine walks itself along a wall over a season. And it was walking, slowly, patiently, toward the sound. It had a vocabulary by then that frightened him worse than the eye did. It had the kettle and the screen door, and the wall switch and the truck's cold cough in the yard. It had the particular three-note creak of the fourth stair. It had the radio's voices run together into a low, meaningless human babble that it kept under its breathing, like a man humming while he works. And it had his cough. It had learned his cough perfectly, the wet morning rasp of a man who'd breathed cold diesel air for 30 years. And the first time it coughed at him out of the dark, his own lungs sound coming up out of the pale meat on his floor, he understood with a clarity that put the hair up on his arms that it was not mimicking him, practicing being him. It was trying him on. By the end of the first week, it had an eye. It grew under a film at first, a cloudy lens swimming up out of the pale meat, the way a stone surfaces in a thawing field. And then one morning the film cleared and it was looking at him. Not a human eye. It had no white to it, no color he could name. A dark, wet hemisphere like a drop of oil held in tension. And it tracked him across the room with a smoothness that no living eye has. No jerk, no blink. Just a slow oiled following, and when he stood very still it kept looking at the place he had been a moment before, as if it were watching not him, but the shape his moving left in the air. He drank more that week. He won't lie to you about that. He had a flask he kept in the truck, for the cold runs up the spine, and he brought it inside, and he sat across from the thing in the evenings with the flask and the work light, and he drank and he talked, and twice, God help him, he tipped the flask toward it, the way you'd offer a man a pull, an old reflex, the manners of a body that had drunk with other bodies. And the second time he did it, the flesh made a sound he had not heard it make before. It said in his own voice, flat and seamless, all right. He dropped the flask. The whiskey ran out across the boards, and the flesh's cord, where the spill reached it, drank it, the gray wood darkening. And the thing said it again, his own two words in his own dead tired voice. All right, all right. And then it tried other sounds. The kettle's rising note, the screen door's two-part complaint, the click of the wall switch, running through the inventory of the week, like a man checking he has his keys. And Cobb sat in the spreading whiskey with his back against the wall, and understood that it had not been listening for company. It had been collecting him. He should have killed it then. He thought about it every way a man can think about a thing. He thought about the chainsaw, and he thought about the can of gas in the shed, and the long match. He thought about salt, about quick climb, about the deep cut, and the long wait. He stood over it more than one night with the axe, and the breathing went on under the axe head, patient, unbothered, his own breath thrown back at him a half-beat slow, and he could not bring the axe down, and he told himself it was fear, that he didn't know what was in it, that fire might spread it, that cutting it might wake whatever the cord ran to under the house and the hill. All of that was true. But it wasn't the truth, and a man who has watched his wife die learns to know the difference. The truth was that he had already lost everything he loved in that house by being unable to fix it. By standing at the foot of a bed for 3 months, with his good hands useless at his sides, and somewhere in him the wiring had crossed so that he could not stand over one more living thing in his house and end it, even a thing that had no right to live, even a thing that was wearing his voice. He could not do it. He hated that he could not do it. He went to bed, and the thing in the front room breathed his breathing back to him through the wall, and in the morning it had grown a second eye and the start of a mouth. The mouth learned fast. It had the radio, and it had him, and it had 8 months of a house with one voice in it, and the mouth was hungriest. For the one voice the house didn't have anymore. It found June on a gray Tuesday. He was at the stove and he heard her say his name behind him. Not an imitation. Not the flat, seamless copy it had done with his own voice. It said Martin, the way she had said it. The small lift at the end that meant she wanted him to come look at something. A bird, a light on the reservoir, the small daily wonders she had kept finding right up until the end, when there was no breath left to lift his name with, and the spoon went still in his hand, and he did not turn around. because if he turned around she would not be there. There would only be the thing, the dark eyes, the new mouth. And he was not strong enough that morning to trade her voice for that. It said again, coaxing, loving wrong. And here is the thing he understood, standing at the stove with his back to his dead wife's voice. It was not cruelty. He kept waiting to feel the cruelty in it. And the cruelty never came, because there was no one home in it to be cruel. It had simply learned, the way water learns the lowest path, that this sound, these two syllables in this exact shape, did more to him than any other sound it owned. It moved him hardest. It opened him widest. He had taught it. In his grief and his loneliness and his idiot need to be listened to. Exactly where the deepest seam in him ran, and now it set its blind, patient tools into that seam, because that was where the most of him came out. It was not hurting him to hurt him. It was hurting him to read him. Pain was just the brightest light it had to see him by. That was the day he stopped drinking. He needed to think, and he could not think drunk. And he had a feeling, cold and certain in the gut, that he did not have as long as he wanted, because the thing had changed again. It had stopped only collecting. Now it was asking. He felt it more than heard it. A pressure behind the eyes when he was near it. A leaning. A question with no words to it. And when he closed his own eyes near it, he got pictures that were not his. He got a sense of vastness, of cold and patient distance, of a great slow attention, turned a long way off and beginning, very gradually, to turn this way. He got the sense of a tally being kept, of a thing not yet finished but close. He got, once, with a clarity that put him on his knees in the front room, with his hands flat on the cold boards, the understanding that the breathing thing was not an animal and not an invader. It was a question being asked about him, about all of him, every man and woman and child of him, and that when the question had its answer, the answer would be sent home, and that something would come for the answer. It was a seed. He didn't have a better word. A seed dropped on a world to taste it, to grow itself the tools, to taste the thing that ran the world, the loud, warm thing that kept the radios going, and to learn that thing all the way down to the seam, and then to call. And it was close to calling. He could feel how close. Days, maybe a week. He sat with that for a long night, the longest of his life, longer than the night June stopped, and somewhere in the dark of it the irritation came back. The small, stupid first morning irritation. This is my floor and nothing belongs on it. I did not put here. And it grew in him through the night into something that was not courage, exactly, and was not hope, but was the oldest and most stubborn thing he owned, the thing that had kept him going up the cold spine in weather that killed younger men, the thing that had kept him at the foot of June's bed for 3 months when the smart money said, go home and sleep. He was not going to let it call. He did not know how to stop it from calling. He knew, he had always known, that there is a difference between a thing you cannot fix and a thing you will not stop working on, and that the whole of his life had been lived in that difference. So, he did the only thing a man like him knows how to do with a thing he doesn't understand. He studied how it worked. He sat with it sober for 2 days, and he watched it ask its question, and he watched what answers fed it. He had thought at first that it ran on sound, then on grief. It was subtler than that and dumber than that both at once. What it wanted was a pattern. It wanted him to be a thing that could be written down. Every time he did what it expected, he could feel it firm up, settle, grow surer, the way a foot finds the next stair in the dark. When he drank and slumped and let June's voice gut him, it firmed. When he raged at it, when he wept, when he begged, when he stood over it with the axe and could not swing, all of it firmed. Because all of it was legible. All of it was the kind of thing a grieving, cornered animal does. And somewhere in its long, patient memory it had grieving, cornered animals catalogued by the 1,000 and the million, and he was filling in a form it already had the shape of. It was almost finished writing him down. And on the morning of the second sober day, watching June's mouth and his own eyes look back at him out of the meat on his floor, Martin Cobb did the math the way he'd have done it on a frozen wellhead. And he understood the shape of the only move he had. And it made him laugh out loud. One short, ugly bark of a laugh that surprised them both. Beat it. He couldn't kill it. He couldn't outrun the thing that was coming for the answer. But he could make sure the answer was wrong. He could make himself a thing that could not be written down. Pretty, he started that morning. He made 2 cups of coffee and set one down in front of it, steaming, absurd, on a saucer with June's blue rim, and he said, "Drink up." And he watched it not understand, watched the eyes track the steam, watched the question behind his own eyes get a noise in it, a static. Because a cornered grieving animal does not make coffee for the thing eating its house, and there was no line on the form for this. He sang to it, badly. He had no voice and he knew it, and he leaned into knowing it. He sang the tune June used to hum. The one with no words that anyone remembered, except he gave it words, terrible words, words about diesel, and the price of feed and the dent in the truck. He made up on the spot and changed, every time so it could never catch the pattern, and when it tried to sing June's tune back to him in June's voice he sang, over it, off-key, joyful, ruinous, until the 2 melodies tangled into something that was neither hers nor its and was, he realized, the first thing that had been only his in 8 months. He lied to it. He told it long detailed false things about his life, that he had 9 brothers, that he had been to the moon, that the reservoir below the house was full of fish the size of dogs. And then he told it true things in exactly the same voice, that he had loved one woman his whole life and watched her go, that he was afraid, that he was tired, and he gave it no way to tell the lies from the truths, no tell, no tremors, no shift in his breathing, because he was past being able to feel the difference himself by then. And he watched the static behind his eyes grow. He forgave it. That was the one that nearly broke it, he thinks. One evening, tired all the way through, he sat down by it, and he put his hand flat on the warm, pale meat. The first time he had touched it on purpose, and he felt it flinch, felt the breathing skip, and he said, "I know you can't help it. I know there's nobody in there. It's all right." And he meant it, which was the trouble, because a cornered animal does not lay its hand on the thing that's killing it and pardon it. There is no form for the hand. There is no form for the pardon. And the eyes went wild trying to find the line to write it on, and there was no line. He kept it warm. That was the strategy underneath all the others, the one he never said out loud even to himself. Because it was the one that should have been impossible. The nights had turned hard, and the front room held the cold, and a thing that breathed needed warmth. He could see it slow in labor when the stove burned down. And so he kept the stove fed through the night for it, hauling wood at 2 in the morning in his coat over his union suit, banking the coals. And he caught himself one of those nights tucking the edge of June's old quilt around the base of it where the cord went into the floor. The way you'd tuck in a child. The way he had not tucked anything in since the house went quiet. And he stopped with his hands full of quilt, and he laughed out loud at himself. Alone in the dark, a man keeping his murderer warm, and the laugh was the most unwritable thing of all, because there was no fear in it, and no surrender in it. Only the black helpless humor of a creature that has looked at the end of its world, and found it absurd. He offered it the flask again. On purpose this time, deliberate, a dare, and gave it the smile he used to give June across a bad situation. The one that said, "Well, here we are, isn't this something?" And the thing tried to give the half-smile back with June's mouth, and could not make it land because a half-smile is not a shape. It is a whole life behind a shape, and it had everything of him by then, except the life. He told it the truth about the worst day. He had never told anyone. He sat down by it in the small hours, and he told it about the foot of the bed and the 3 months, and the good useless hands. And he told it true and complete and in order, and then, the moment it had the shape of his grief held firm, the moment he felt it settle into the catalogue, with a kind of sigh of completion. He laughed right in the middle of the worst of it. A real laugh at a real thing June would have laughed at. The memory of her swearing at the frost ferns on the glass, like they'd been put there, to spite her personally. And he felt the catalogue buckle, felt it scramble, because grief and laughter in the same breath do not go on the same line. A thing that does both at once in the dark over a dead woman's voice is a thing no instrument cross on the dark had ever been built to hold. He fed it contradictions until it choked on them. He was kind and then careless. He wept, and then made a joke through the weeping. He treated it as his enemy, and his guest, and his patient, and his pet, and his confessor, sometimes all in 1 hour, and he never once let it find the through line, because the secret he had been carrying his whole life, without knowing it was a secret, was that there was no through line, that a man is not one thing, That June used to say he was 9 different men before noon and she'd married all of them. And what had felt his whole life like a flaw, a failure to settle, a roughness, turned out in the last week of the world to be the one weapon nobody could take off him. He was not legible. None of them were, not really. The thing had 1,000,000 animals written down, and not one of them was a man, on the 8th month of grief making coffee for his murderer, and singing it, the wrong words to a dead woman's tune. And the sky began to change. It started as a pressure, the kind that comes before a storm but with no storm in it, a thickness in the high cold air over the reservoir. The water down in the drained gray basin went strange, trembling in still air, and at night there was a light up past the cloud, not a star, not moving like a plane. A held light, getting no nearer and no smaller, the patience of the thing on the other end of the question, waiting on its answer. The flesh strained toward the deadline he couldn't see, but could feel pressing. The breathing gone ragged now. The eyes clouding and clearing. The ear deforming, because he was feeding it more than it could write, and it was using itself up trying to write him anyway. Faithful to its one purpose to the last. A tool that did not know how to be anything but a tool. On the last night the light came down through the cloud. It did not land. It hung over the reservoir. Vast, and he could not look at the whole of it at once. His eye kept sliding off the size of it. And the pressure of the great cold attention turned full on the house, on the front room, on the thing in the middle of his floor. And he felt the question reach its end. He felt it ask, finally, completely for the answer. Clean line that said what this species was. This loud, warm radio-keeping thing. What it did when it was cornered. How it broke. Where the seam ran so that the great patient thing in the sky could send. What it sent to worlds whose answer was clean. The way it had sent it 1,000,000 times. To worlds whose people fought or fled or folded in patterns the seed had read in a season. And the seed had no clean line to give. He knelt down by it at the end. He could feel it dying, using the last of itself to transmit. And he did the last unwritable thing. The thing there was no form for. The thing that a cornered animal in the final hour of its world does not do. He did not fight the light, and he did not run from it, and he did not curse it. He gathered the dying flesh up off the boards, the warm, pale, ruined meat of it, the cord tearing free of the soft gray wood, and he held it against his chest the way you hold a thing that is leaving, the way he had held June's hand at the foot of the bed, when there was nothing left in his good hands to do but be warm, and he hummed the tune, June's tune, just the tune now. No words, no lies, just the warm, wordless thing one animal does for another. In the dark, and he said into the dying meat of the thing that had worn his wife's voice, "It's all right. You can stop now. You did your best. Nobody could have written me down. I'd even do it myself." He felt the answer go up. He felt it go wrong. He felt the great cold attention receive what the seed sent, and he felt it stop, the way a man stops with his foot halfway to a stair that isn't there. And he understood, kneeling on his cold floor with the dying thing against his chest, that what had gone up was not a clean line. It was the static. It was the contradiction. It was a coffee cup, and a lie told like a truth, and a hand laid in pardon on a killer, and a man singing the wrong words over his dead wife's voice, and holding his murderer like a child. All of it, none of it resolving. A signal that said, this species cannot be written down. This species does not break in a pattern. This species will lay its hand on the thing that ends it, and forgive it, and you will never, never know what it will do. And the great cold thing, which had crossed the dark to 1,000 worlds, and taken every one whose answer was clean, did the one thing a patient thing does when the answer is not clean. It did not stay to learn the long, hard way, what an unwritable species does, to the thing that comes to harvest it. It had not crossed all that dark by running that kind of risk. The light over the reservoir held a long moment, the longest of his life, the longest in the long life of the world. And then it drew up through the cloud, and the pressure lifted off the house, and the high cold air went ordinary again. And the held light was a small thing, then a far thing, then a thing among the other stars. And then it was gone. And Martin Cobb knelt to the floor of his own house in the silence, holding a fist of cooling meat against his chest, and breathing alone, in no pattern at all. Flesh sighed once more in his arms. Quiet, almost gone. He waited for it to say June's name. It had earned the right, he figured, to leave on the cruelest thing it owned. And he braced for it. ready to forgive that too. Shh. It didn't. With the last breath in his own tired voice, the voice it had taken first, off the bottom of a flask, on a cold night, when he was alone, and offering whiskey to his own ruin out of pure animal manners, it said, "All right." And then it was only meat, cooling, and the breathing in the house was just his. And the radio in the kitchen was talking about the weather to nobody. And Martin Cobb sat down on his own floor in the gray before dawn, and laughed and wept at once, in no pattern, a man no instrument would ever resolve. The loud, warm radio-keeping thing that had been measured by something that had measured 1,000 worlds, and been found, alone among all of them, to be too much trouble to take. He buried it in the yard by the fence, next to where June was, because it had worn her voice, and a thing that wears your dead wife's voice gets a place by the fence. Those were just the manners of it. He filled the floor back in. He fixed the soft gray boards, cut new pine, set it true, the work going easy in his good hands the way work had not gone easy in a year. He did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell, and no one would have written it down right anyway, and that, he had learned, was the whole of the thing. That was the part that had saved them all. The part no machine could hold. He put the coffee on. 2 cups, out of habit, the way he'd done it that last week, and then, catching himself, he laughed and poured one out, and then, thinking better of it, he didn't. He carried the second cup out to the fence and set it down on the cold ground, with June's blue rim turned up to the morning, steam going off it into the high, clean air. And he stood there in his socks, with his own breath fogging in no rhythm at all, the most ordinary man in the world, who had saved it and who would go in now and have his coffee and live. Past the cloud, the small, far light did not come back. It never did.